All right, for all you parents in the room, I need you to get brave and honest with me for just a moment. Raise your hands if you have ever lost your kid. Oh, wow, look at that. Some of y'all are like, yeah, it happens all the time. It happens, doesn't it? And the good news is we're in good company this morning because the scripture that we're in is Luke chapter 2, and it's the story of Mary and Joseph, Jesus' parents, losing Jesus. And he was just a young boy, age 12. And they were at some large religious gathering. And there is something about large religious gatherings where it's just a ripe atmosphere for losing a kid. I don't know. It happens. In fact, it was Christmas Eve just a few nights ago. And for the 3 o'clock service, I was sitting here in the front row, and Tammy, my wife, gets in right before the service starts, and she's got Selah, our 8-year-old daughter, with her, and Breck, our 2-year-old boy, he's in the nursery, and she plops down next to me, and she does one of these. What'd I do? Where's Shiloh? Our 5-year-old daughter, where's Shiloh? Honey, I don't know where she is. I thought you had her. No, Ryan, she was in your office, and you were supposed to bring her in with you when you came and sat down. Where's Shiloh? Honey, I don't know. I got to stand up and give the welcome here in a minute. I can't go find Shiloh. Sure enough, about 3 minutes later, when our anxieties are way up here, Shiloh comes sprinting down the center aisle like she does. Something about large religious gatherings. It happens. So here's the story with Jesus and his parents. So Mary and Joseph and Jesus, in fact, their whole tribe, but the whole Jewish tribe was in Jerusalem for what's called the Passover festival. Thousands upon thousands of Jews gathered in Jerusalem. It was one of the 3 major festivals of the year. And of course, Passover, they would be celebrating the time when they as a people were liberated from slavery in Egypt. And they're in Jerusalem, and they lose Jesus. Here's how it goes. Luke chapter 2, verse 41 through 50. And you got to picture massive crowds here in Jerusalem. Each year, his parents went up to Jerusalem for Passover festival. When he was 12 years old, they went to Jerusalem according to their custom. After the festival was over, they were returning home. But the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents didn't know it, supposing that he was among their band of travelers, and so they traveled together for safety. They would travel with relatives and neighbors. You'd travel as a community, as a big community. So while they were, supposing he was among their band of travelers, they journeyed on for a full day while looking for him among their family and friends. When they didn't find Jesus, they returned to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, that's a long time to lose a kid. After 3 days, they found him in the temple. Remember this verse. He was sitting among the teachers, listening to them and putting questions to them. Everyone who heard him was amazed by his understanding and his answers. And let's pause there for just a moment. I know we've talked about this before in here, but I want to remind you about the stages of Jewish education. Because for the first century Jewish world, the world of Jesus, education was of utmost importance. They looked at it as a means of survival with them, how their story would continue. And their primary question was, at what age should we begin teaching our children Torah? And Torah, keep in mind, it's the first 5 books of what we now know as the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. These were their scriptures. And what age should we begin teaching Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy? See, if we don't start soon enough, they may not be sponge-like enough to soak it all in, but if we wait too long, then we might miss that critical learning point. And so what they landed on was the first stage of Jewish education called Bet Sefer, and it translates as house of the book. And this was roughly, for kids, roughly between the ages of 6 and 10. And in Bet Sefer, children would go into their local synagogues and they would begin learning from their local synagogue teachers, and they would memorize the entire Torah. Whew. Selah, girl, you've got some work to do. The best of these students would move to the second stage of Jewish education, which was called Bet Talmud, translates as the house of learning. In Bet Talmud, they would memorize the rest of the Hebrew scriptures, and they would also be learning the beautiful ancient art of Jewish questions, because for rabbis, questions were always more important than answers. It was about a journey. It was not about arriving at some right answer. And here's how it would work. A rabbi would stand before a student and would quote a scripture, and that student would be expected to quote the scripture before or after that scripture. Then the rabbi would quote another one, and the student would be expected to quote the one before or after it. And they would go back and forth for hours. And then they would spend hours debating and arguing and getting into these heated conversations about what these texts mean. Because for rabbis, it was in the discussion, the heated debates, how they looked at the developmental process. This is how you learned, this is how you grew, this is how you developed. Now, how old was Jesus in this story? 12 years old. What was he doing? Remember that verse I said to remember? He was sitting among the teachers, listening to them, putting questions to them. Which stage of Jewish education was he in? Bet Talmud. Let's keep going. When his parents saw him, they were shocked. His mother said, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Listen, your father and I have been worried. We've been looking for you." That sounds familiar. Jesus replied, "Why were you looking for me? Didn't you know it was necessary for me to be in my Father's house?" In other words, you knew exactly where I was, Mom. This is smart mouth Jesus here. You knew where I was. I was in the temple because I'm a student in Bet Talmud. I was exactly where I was supposed to do, doing exactly what I needed to do. You knew where I was. Verse 50. But they didn't understand what he said to them. Let's stop the story there. A very common theme in the Gospels. The disciples, the ones closest to Jesus, they were so often missing it. They didn't understand. It's this common theme in the gospel, starting with Jesus' parents. The ones closest to him didn't understand. They missed it. Now, if you're wondering to yourself, why is this story here? I mean, I tell you why I'm preaching on it. It's the one the lectionary gave to me. Why is this story here? It's weird, isn't it? Because you have these birth narratives, and then you get Jesus being a 12-year-old. Nothing between ages 1 and 11. And nothing after this story about his youth and adolescence. Very common in the ancient Greco-Roman world. In fact, if you read biographies from the ancient Greco-Roman world, you see very little of childhood, youth, and adolescent experiences. Because remember, in the first century Greco-Roman world, children were nobodies. I mean, they were considered nobodies. Why would you talk about childhood experiences? Why would you talk about a youth or an adolescent? They were nobodies. So maybe Luke is telling us this story to humanize Jesus just a bit, to humanize his community, his family. I mean, what we get here is a pretty relatable story, pretty relatable Jesus. Or maybe Luke is telling us this story to remind us of Jesus' Jewish roots. Maybe Luke is telling us this story to show us the trajectory of Jesus' life, that even from a young boy, the age of 12, his life was going to be about the things of God. And if that's all this story was doing, I think that's okay. But we could read it, talk about it. It'd be a good story. We could go home and have a good Sunday afternoon. But I think if we let it, this story actually asks us some questions. And see, remember, the scriptures are actually living and breathing when we breathe life into them. They become dialogue partners. We get to ask them questions, but if we're honest and we stay open, the scriptures also get to ask us questions. So as I was reading through this story over the last couple of weeks, I just would keep questions in my phone, questions that I think this story asks of us. And I had over a dozen questions. And so what I tried to do is nail it down to 3 questions that I think this story could ask of us. And see, what I know is tomorrow night, many of y'all are going to gather with friends and family, and we're going to welcome in 2019, which means a new year is upon us, which also means it's always a good time to begin asking questions. We should do this yearly, annually, right? Always a good time to begin asking questions about what we're doing with our lives. So here's the 3 questions I boiled it down to. You may or may not find them helpful. You may or may not want to reflect on these and ask them in your new year. But question number 1, what is missing from your journey? Have you been avoiding taking the time to look at yourself and look at your behavior in the world? Have you been stuck in the blame game? And y'all know about the blame game, right? I mean, you know the blame game. It works on micro and macro levels. It works in big ways and small ways, and we get stuck there. And here's a small way how it works. Ryan wakes up later in the morning because he's trying to squeeze every last minute out of sleep before he has to get up. Finally, Ryan gets up and jumps in the shower, gets out of the shower and gets dressed, and it's still dark outside. Ryan can't find his shoes. He looks for a minute, and he's getting a bit angry. He decides it's a good idea to wake up his wife and say, honey, someone stole my shoes. I can't find my shoes. Someone stole them. Seriously, Ryan, you think someone came in and stole your shoes? It's the only logical explanation I can think of. I know I left them here. Didn't you go outside last night and leave them by the patio door? Oh, shoot, she's right. So I go get my shoes on. I get in the car and I start driving. The bozo in front of me is actually doing the speed limit. Everyone knows you can go 5 miles, plug your ears, Eric. Everyone knows you can go 5 miles over the speed limit and still be in the safety zone. This dude isn't assuming everyone else around him is in a hurry. So I'm going to be late to my meeting. I pull up, I'm late to my meeting, and what have I done? All of a sudden, it's everyone else's fault but mine. What does Mary do in the story? Jesus, why would you do this to us? Why would you do this to us? Me, I was doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing. I was going to speed limit. Why would you do this to us? We have been filled with worry and anxiety. It's true, isn't it? I mean, how many of you all go to that place when something bad happens, you want to know whose fault it is? Because if you can find someone to blame it on, then you actually get a sense that you can control this thing. If you can find someone to blame it on, then you don't have to sit with the discomfort and the pain. And we see this often in big ways, don't we, in times of tragedy, like a divorce. If he wouldn't have done this, and if she wouldn't have done this, then I wouldn't have had to do this thing over here, and I wouldn't have had to do this. Or how about during times of a disease hitting? God, if you would have just answered our prayers the way we prayed, if you would have just done what you said you were going to do, then we wouldn't be in this position. Or suicide. Man, if I could have just done this, if I could have said this differently, if I could have done more of this, then maybe he would still be here. And let's just be honest. When it comes to the blame game, sometimes the problem isn't about you blaming others, it's about you blaming yourself. And you begin to carry these burdens that were never yours to carry. And Brene Brown says, blame is simply the discharging of comfort and pain, of discomfort and pain. See, perhaps a mirror is missing from your journey. You see, mirrors allow us to keep looking inward. Mirrors remind us to keep our side of the street clean before we start looking to the neighbor's side of the street. Mirrors, they remind us to let go of the things that aren't ours to carry. A good friend of mine is always reminding me, if it's too heavy, it's because you picked it up. If it's too heavy, it's because you picked it up. You can let those things go. You see, without a mirror, we keep all the pain and the anger and the resentment in circulation. Is a mirror missing from your journey? And see, the mirror leads to the next question, because if we can see ourselves accurately, then we can ask, where in your life do you need to return? Next slide, please. Where in your life do you need to return? You see, Mary and Joseph, they notice that something is missing from their journey. They notice Jesus is missing, and so they return to Jerusalem, the center of it all, where it all began, the heartbeat of it all. And see, what I know is, and Mary and Joseph might agree with me on this, life gets busy. Just gets busy, and it's so easy to get caught up in the daily grind, and pretty soon it can feel like you're existing, but you're not really living, and pretty soon it just feels like you're just going through the motions. And so it's a good time to ask, what is the thing that gets you out of bed in the morning? What in the heck gets you out of bed? And see, when I was 16 years old, a sophomore in high school, my high school had a program where they would, it was funded, and they would help you set it up. We could go shadow someone for a day, pick a professional and shadow them. I was living in Lake of the Ozarks, Missouri, where I went to high school, and so I wanted to shadow a pastor for the day, a pastor that I looked up to, and he was in the St. Louis area, and so he was gracious enough to me to let me come and spend the entire day with him. So I got up at 4 o'clock that morning, and I drove to spend the whole day with this pastor, and man, I can't tell you everything he said because he said a lot. And I don't remember everything we did because we did a lot. But what I do remember is at one point going into his office, and he was talking about the art of crafting ideas and communicating these ideas. And I saw books everywhere. And he had, back in the day, he had a chalkboard, not a whiteboard, a chalkboard. And he had notes on this chalkboard. And he was talking about the power of ideas. And I thought, man, that's pretty cool. And then he let me sit in a meeting with him where he was talking with this young man about something terribly difficult in his life. And I remember in that moment, like thinking, yeah, this is what I want to do. I want to give myself to this. I want to give my energies to this. I don't even know exactly what this is, but I want to give myself to it. And see, then later in life, when I got sober, I started taking seriously the idea of working through my story and working through the negative turns in my story. My parents' really ugly divorce, and my brother's death, and his addiction, and my addiction, and the addiction that runs so deeply in my family. And see, what I found is it was bringing me back to my life theme. It was bringing me back to the thing I wanted to do in life, and that phrase hangs in my office. It's become my mantra, and that is, I want to help others experience God and beauty in the midst of mess and brokenness. Because see, for me, I have always encountered God. I've had the most profound experiences with God at the bottom, when things are seemingly falling apart. And I've always experienced this idea that it is possible to have beauty in the midst of struggle. I mean, there's a reason on my wrist I have beauty tattooed on this arm and struggle tattooed on this arm, because they so often go together. And see, what I know is, if you open yourself to it, through prayer and through listening to others, if you open yourself to it, God has a way of bringing you back. And see, I think the trick is figuring out the thing you're passionate about. Figure out who God is calling you to be. Figure out what that thing is that gets you out of bed in the morning. And see, the Japanese, they have a word for it. You know what they call it? They call it your ikigai. Say that word with me, ikigai. Has anyone ever heard of the ikigai? It's a beautiful way to look at life. Rob Bell, he writes about the ikigai, and he says this: your ikigai is that sense you have when you wake up that this day matters, that there are new experiences to be had, that you have work to do, a contribution to make. Sometimes this is referred to as your calling. Other times, your vocation, your destiny, your path. Your ikigai is your reason for being. Pretty good, isn't it? And see, what I know about your ikigai, it always keeps your ego in check. Because your ego will try to get you to believe that you can do everything. You can do it all. Your ego will try to get you to say yes to everything. And your ikigai has very little patience for your ego. Your ikigai will always call you back to that central thing, to that thing that you were called to that one that God is calling you to be. And by the way, notice in the story how crystal clear Jesus was, even at the age of 12, about who he was and what his life was going to be about. Where in your life do you need return? Third and final question. What are the things that keep you from relationship with God? And as I was writing this part, as I was thinking through it, I thought, man, this could be a whole sermon series. And I'm going to try to do it in like a minute. What are the things that keep you from relationship with God? You see, as a pastor for over the past decade plus, what I've seen again and again and again and again is people who want to live lives of meaning and peace and significance and joy, and people who see that their spirituality is central to who they are, but they're also people who can no longer buy into. They can no longer give themselves to these old conceptions and dominant images of God. And if you ever want to start a lively conversation, just walk into a room full of people and ask this question: what kind of God did you grow up with? Man, you will hear stories of trauma, of pain, of betrayal, of anger. And here's the truth. I don't know why the Holocaust happened. I don't know why that beautiful newborn baby didn't survive long after birth. I don't know why your uncle was diagnosed with that brain tumor. But what I do know is lots of people were given only this particular conception of God, and they're still living with it. That God is somewhere up there, and God may or may not come down from time to time and do God sorts of things and bring punishment and judgment and suffering to people who deserve it. And I see it all the time. People wrestling with this notion of God who's just full of anger and punishment and judgment. And it leads so many people to say, man, I don't need God. I don't need that. And if the world was honest, they don't need that God either. Don't let old conceptions, dominant images of God keep you from being in relationship with a God who is full of love and grace and mercy and compassion. May you be reminded of the God we've been anticipating all throughout Advent, the God we celebrated in Christmas Eve, the God we still celebrate during this Christmas season, and that is the God who came to be with us, the God who comes to be with us in all our mess. Not a God who comes and is just waiting to judge, waiting to hammer, waiting to punish, but a God who comes to be with us, a God who came into the world to be with us and go through all of it with us. Remember, we celebrate light coming into the darkness, God coming in to be with us. So as we hear this song, and it's a 5-minute song, so you're going to have some time to reflect. I invite you to reflect on these 3 questions that we have explored. What's missing in your journey? Have you been stuck in the blame game? Do you need to let some of that go? Do you need to own some things? And where in your life do you need to return? What's the things you're passionate about? Where is God calling you? Who is God calling you to be? And third, what are the things that keep you from relationship with God? Because God is better than all the hate, the anger, the judgment, the bringing on of suffering. God's better than that. I invite you to take some time and reflect.